Hello, it's Bob Pandolfo. Welcome to Power Pace. It's Monday, November 3rd. November 3rd, 2025, a couple days after the Breeders' Cup is over. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to get out of a slump. You know, when you all of a sudden your picks aren't running well anymore and you're losing. And I'm going to talk a little bit, have a little bit of a wrap up on the Breeders' Cup. I thought the racing was good, and there were some really nice performances. I think one of the things that was unfortunate were the scratches. There were a lot of vet scratches. Here's a list of I think they say here there were like 12 scratches. But you had Tamara, who was a vet scratch. Sweet Azteca was a vet scratch. Arizona Blaze, an outstanding horse who I was really looking forward to seeing. You had all right, Scottish Lassie, the trainer, that was a trainer scratch. Sovereignty was a trainer scratch. That spiked the fever. But Mystic Dan was a vet scratch. And then you had another one, Stiller in the turf. So a lot of these horses, years ago they wouldn't have been scratched. So what's happened? So you had that situation at Santa Anita a few years ago, with a bunch of horses were breaking down. It was terrible. Track, whatever was going on, they couldn't figure it out. They had to shut the track down, and then they had to make all kinds of changes to the track. They basically tried to put more of a cushion on it. They eventually got it corrected, but that meet was terrible. Now since then, of course, you also have the government, which with HISA coming in and creating a situation where they're keeping a closer eye on the sport, and they have their own regulations and rules that are in place in most states now that have thoroughbred racing, including Southern California. So of course they have limits on medication and things like that. Also, what some tracks are doing, and this is what they're doing in Southern California, is they're having these vets look at the horses more carefully before, as they come onto the track and get ready, for a race, like in the post parade and coming up to the starting gate even. Now, look, there's older horses, like, there are horses that are 7, 8 years old, they've raced a lot. You cannot kind of understand some of those scratches. And they're trying to say that, well, if you look at the record of our scratches, our vet scratches, a lot of them don't come back to race for, quite a few months. So we were right, we made the right decision. But this is different. These are young horses that are in the prime of their life. These are not like a bunch of old claimers. And this is odd. This is really odd. Don't forget, you have these people that have these, expensive racehorses. They've got them prepared to run the best race, one of their best races in a major stakes race on the biggest racing day of the year for, a ton of money. And most of these trainers, of course, are high-profile trainers, are very successful trainers, Hall of Fame trainers. You look at Tamara. I was really looking forward. She was one of the two horses I was really looking forward to betting. The other was Forever Young, who was my bet. I had two best bets, Tamara and Forever Young. And Tamara is trained by Richard Mandella. Now, he's been around a long time. He's a great horseman. He's in the Hall of Fame. He wouldn't have entered this filly if he thought that she wasn't physically able to race in this race. You know what I mean? And like, you're going to tell me that these vets know more about somebody else's horse than a man who trains the horse, who's very, very successful trainer. He's actually a legend. I think I don't know. I can understand that you want to, you don't want horses breaking down, but and some of this, it looks kind of funny too, because like they scratched Sweet Azteca, and there's a little controversy about that with Joseph Safi, the trainer. They were apparently they were looking them over and before the races start, and they want he was prepared. Apparently he had all the papers and vet reports and everything. I don't know, I just, these trainers, And some of you know that I've been. I wrote something about Bob Baffert back in 2020. In November of 2020, I wrote an article. It's on my website about Bob Baffert and about how I thought that he was, a suspicious kind of trainer in certain ways, And I'm not going to go into all the details now, but one thing that really, really, struck me was that he had these 7 horses drop dead in a 16-month period. Not from injuries. Their heart went out. And Southern California at that time, they created a lot of these problems, Southern California, because at that time, the CHRB, with the racing board, the people that were in the board at that time, they're different now, they're different people. But at that time, there was a long period there where they were just letting these trainers get away with stuff, and they investigated these deaths that Baffert had in his barn. These were like, young, healthy horses that all of a sudden dropped dead. And they said that they didn't find them. They didn't find them. They didn't suspend them. I was totally flabbergasted that nothing. And they said, we couldn't find any wrongdoing or something. But the thing is, Baffert said something that he made a remark that he used a drug on the horses for a thyroid drug. And he said, well, yeah, I gave him this thyroid drug. He says, because I think that may build them up or something. That alone should have resulted in a suspension and a fine. Because you shouldn't give an animal a drug that they don't need. Right? These horses didn't have a thyroid problem. Imagine yourself. They say you went to the doctor and your doctor says to you, hey, I'm going to give you this thyroid drug. Well, you'd say, do I have a problem with my thyroid? And the doctor says to you, well, no, but I kind of like this drug. I think it might make you feel good, Well, you'd probably be doing a beeline out the door and trying to find another doctor, if you have any common sense. So they did these things like that. It was just, I hate to say it, but the CHRB back then was pathetic. They were just pathetic. And, in that particular instance I'm talking about too, Rick Arthur was on the board, and Rick Arthur had been a vet himself, had been in the business for a long time. He had, I think, like 30 years. And he said, when Baffert made that remark about the thyroid drug, he was like, that doesn't make any sense. Thyroid drug, if anything, can make you lose weight. Baffert says it would build them up. And then they tried to get rid of Rick Arthur because he wasn't, getting in line, but trying to protect Baffert. And they did these kind of things. And they created a lot, and even with their track problems, they created a lot of their own problems. You may remember years ago, they went to synthetic in 2008. The reason why they went to synthetic was because of breakdowns. And then trainers like Baffert and Sadler and a few other people were complaining about the synthetic because they like dirt, they like, speed favoring fast tracks. And then they put this terrible synthetic track in Santa Anita. They screwed it up. They didn't have the proper drainage. They just did a terrible job. They put in this thing called the cushion track. And then they went back to dirt, and then the dirt track they put in was terrible. It was I don't know if you remember that, but you had like 10 claimers going like 107 and 2 in 6 furlong races. It was one of the worst tracks, dirt, when they first put the dirt track in after it gets synthetic. Now they fixed that up. Right now the track in Santa Anita and the tracks in Delmore are in good shape. And I think they have enough cushion and everything. But boy, I tell you, they created a lot of their own problems. Now they're kind of overdoing this, I guess because of all these problems they had years ago. And again, some of I think pretty much most of these vet scratches during the Breeders' Cup, I think really very questionable. Like I said, these trainers are not going to, even someone like Baffert. Now, I've been critical of Baffert. But if Baffert puts a horse in a race, right, on these big days, he's not going to put the horse in the race if he thinks the horse is not physically capable of handling it. You know what I mean? And of course, Baffert trains his horses fast. These horses were all training on a regular basis, drilling these fast 5 furlong workouts that he does. So he knows that they can physically handle it. The way he trains his horses, the horses have to be sound. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to work out. Because he trains them so fast. So, some of the horses that there was some good overlays I thought overall. Like in the distaff, I had picked Seismic Beauty. Now that was a Baffert horse that really didn't fire, but I put Scylla. I think now I just watched the race and I can't remember how to pronounce her name. I think it's Celia. I picked her second, and she won. I picked Nitrogen third, so that was a pretty nice overlay and a nice exactor, like a $60 exactor. This was an interesting race because Ethical Diamond was a horse that had been jumping and then had won a couple of kind of allowance races. Comes in here, and it's so interesting too because the trainer from Ireland, William Mullins. This guy is a great trainer in Ireland, but he's known for his jump horses, his steeplechase horses. So he had been running his horses steeplechases, but then he had run a couple of good races in the flat, and his assistant trainer says, "I think you should put this horse in the Breeders' Cup." So they came over here with the horse, and I mean he won a huge race here. This horse, he beat Rebel's Romance. Rebel's Romance, which that's the horse I picked. That's a great horse. I mean, he went right by him. That was a bit of a surprise. I was surprised the horse only paid $57. Forever Young was my best bet, and of course I had Sierra Leone in there. But Forever Young, I mean, if you watch this horse's career, great horse. Came over for the Derby, when he was a 3-year-old, and that was the race where Sierra Leone was banging into him the whole stretch, and he only lost by a head. Then last year he came in for the Classic, and that was that race where they went, wicked pace. So they went to the half in 44-4, and his jockey kept him too close from the rail. He had post one. Maybe it's not all the jockey's fault because the horse, it naturally wanted to run with these horses, so he was too close to that 44-4, and he finished third. But he raced very gamely in that race. This race he got a really nice trip. And one of the reasons why I liked him too, I didn't think you'd have that crazy pace to set up the closers like Sierra Leone and journalism. So the pace was more modest. So that $9 was a good price for that, and the exacta was a good price considering the Forever Young. He's a really outstanding horse. He always fires. It's so great too because the owners, Fujita, and the trainer, this great trainer Yoshito Yahagi. They're saying, they're going to race him in Dubai again next winter, and if he keeps running well, they're going to keep racing him, which is great because there's so many of these, wealthy people that own these horses. Right away, they want to retire them, So it's just great. That's a great thing to see for the sport. And we got to see Nisos. I thought that was a highlight too because this was a great race, the Breeders' Cup Mile. Nisos and Citizen Bull both ran huge races here. Citizen Bull really kind of surprised me. I mean, he's a good horse, but I thought when Nisos came into the stretch that he'd pull away from him and win by length and a half, 2 lanes, but it was right, battle right down to the wire, so it was good. So I want to talk a little bit about, slumps. People always ask me, well, all of a sudden I'm in a cold streak. How do I get out of a cold streak? Well, let's look at how cold streaks start. Years ago, there was this one year where I was having this is when Aqueduct had the Intertrack. I had a good Aqueduct Intertrack meet, a good Belmont spring meet, a good Saratoga meet in the summer. Belmont fall meet opened, and I just went ice cold, and so one of the first things you want to do is look at other handicappers. Now in New York, of course, there's a lot of public handicappers. It's a small track, there might not be that many, but in New York, I looked at other guys to see, like some of these horses that were winning. I just thought, I don't see I can have this horse. So I looked at some of the handicappers and did anybody else have this horse picked first, second, or third, or even, No. Everybody was missing these horses. So this is one of the things when you follow a circuit. A lot of people say, well, you should follow only one circuit because then you know the horses and the trainers. One of the disadvantages of that, though, is sometimes you get into these odd times when horses aren't, the form isn't holding up and strange things are happening and getting these strange long shots. And at that point, the best thing to do is either, bet really small or take a break or bet another track. And that's one of the advantages of using, like, say, computer handicapping systems where you can play multiple tracks because it doesn't take that long to handicap. And I actually think doing that, you have less of a chance of getting into a really bad cold streak. One of the things you have to be careful of is that if you're going well and all of a sudden you're not going well, that you change something. If you're spending 2 hours a day to handicap a card and all of a sudden you're spending an hour and all of a sudden you're not picking that many winners, you just got too cocky, you're not doing the work. Again, one of the nice things about using the computer systems, though, it doesn't take that long to handicap because the computer is doing the thinking for you. The algorithms in the program are basically all the things that you're doing in your head. It's doing it in a matter of a split second. That particular year, though, at Belmont, when they came back for the fall meet, I did realize certain things. Now, I didn't have all these computer systems at that time. I only had the Diamond system, so I didn't have the Formula Pro. I didn't have real time. I didn't have Power Pace, and I didn't have my new one, the Triple Edge system. If I did, maybe some of those long shots, those systems would have put me on those horses, or maybe some of those horses. But that particular fall meeting, though, I noticed that a lot of the horses that had raced hard in the spring and summer, like at Belmont and Saratoga, and some of the other tracks, Churchill Downs, horses that were shipping in, they weren't firing at the fall meet, right? So you have to be careful about that, because what's happening is you get these really tough races, during the summer, and even in the spring, because that's when the season really starts. All the good horses come out and they're all revved up, and trainers are trying to get them to run big for during these meets. Like you look at a Saratoga meet, for instance. If you're a trainer, even like your claiming horses and your allowance horses, you've got your owners coming to Saratoga and they want their horse to win. So you have to really get that horse in peak form. That's how you stay in the business. You got to win, otherwise your owners are going to find somebody else. And especially at a meet like that, because the owners are more likely to be there. They're not home watching it on TV. So the horses, are running hard against tough fields. They came into Belmont where it's the fall meet, you expect it to be a little easier. And some horses looked like they were in soft spots. Like, well, this horse ran against a tougher field at Saratoga, probably going to win here. And they come up flat, right? So they're just, they already fired their best shots. And because they come into these meets. Say look at Belmont spring meet, and this is a lot of spring meets throughout the country. They're coming off a layoff. They're fresh. The horse is fresh. He's ready to go. Maybe he doesn't win that race, but he's going to win. Maybe the next race or his third race, or they may be able to keep him sharp right through Saratoga, because they may run him, say, twice in the spring and twice at Saratoga. It's only 4 starts, but then by the time he gets to Belmont, now he's run several races in a shorter period of time, and he's already run his best, right? They had him training hard, they had him ready to go. Now he comes up flat. And I saw this a lot when I went over the meet. I was like, why are my horses running well? So I had to make adjustments, and that's the thing with this game. You always have to make adjustments. My fall meets have been better since then, and I don't remember what year that was. This is going back probably 12 years ago or something like that. But my fall meets have been better because of that, because any horses that have been used hard at Saratoga especially, and especially if they race more than once at Saratoga during the meet, and they're wheeling back and they don't have a lot of rest in between, I'm a little leery now, especially if they're going to get bet. You don't want to bet these favorites that they don't have much left in the tank. Another thing to do, though, when it comes to if you're in a cold streak, things aren't going well, is to specialize more. In other words, be more selective. Now, how do you be? One of the best things to do to be selective is only bet horses that are dropping in class. Only bet horses in dropping in class. I mean, that's the best advice I can give anyone. Years ago, a lot of people used to say, "Oh, they're dropping it. There's something wrong with the horse." That doesn't hold up anymore, for the most part. I mean, with some of these cheap claimers, maybe, but horses don't. the thoroughbreds don't race as much as they used to years ago. So, like years ago, it was very common to see horses race like 15 times in a year. Now, a lot of these racehorses are racing 7, 8 times. You're lucky you get 10 starts out of them. They can't afford to, just send out horses like in spots like to try to build up their stamina or something. They want, every time most of these trainers put a horse on a track, they're trying to win that race. If they drop them in class, they're just trying to win. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the horse. They're just trying to find a spot. If you look at somebody like Linda Rice in New York, she's really a remarkable trainer because she's always like up there with like Chad Brown and Todd Pletcher. She's right in that same company in terms of wins anyway, not in terms of purse money because she's running basically claiming horses. My screen went off there for a second, sorry. But she's running claiming horses and she wins at a high percentage. But how does she do it? She drops them in where they can win. And so one of the things especially is only bet horses that are dropping down if you're not doing well, because a lot of races are won by horses dropping down because the trainers are looking for a winning spot. And actually, you can't just bet every horse that's dropping down, but you have to pick your spots. But that's one thing. Another thing you can do is avoid races where it's just way too competitive. Like a lot of these allowance races, like non-winners are 2, non-winners are 3. You got a whole bunch of horses in there, and I've mentioned this before, that have won 8, 9, 10 races. They're in for, say, non-winners 2 other than, but they've won 7 in claiming races, plus a maiden race, and a non-winners of 1. So they're in against a bunch of, really good professional racehorses. It's really hard to find sometimes, in a lot of those races, it's really hard to find a horse that has any sort of advantage. So, you could look more like for maiden claiming races with restrictions, or like a non-winners are 2 life, non-winners are 3 winners life. Maiden special weight races where there aren't first-time starters, and maybe there's only 1 first-time starter. You just have to pick spots where you have more of a chance of cashing your ticket. And some of these races, it's true that in competitive races you can get value, but like if you're playing 12 horse, 6 furlong turf sprints, it's hard to pick the winner. So you're going to have losing streaks if you're playing races like that. So you got to pick out races where you think you can get the winner, and like I said, specialize for a while. Don't bet if the horse isn't dropping in class. Don't bet them. Just go to try to find horses dropping in class, because it's one of the things that when horses drop in class, especially if it doesn't look like there's anything really wrong with the horse, like he's running okay, and he's got a couple some recent workouts. There's nothing really suspicious. They're looking for a spot to win, right? And when you get in with weaker, as a thoroughbred horse, it makes a huge difference. Now there's some drops that are more significant, but I'll have a video on. I'll do a video on key drops, but it just makes a huge difference. The horse can feel like a completely different animal because he's been racing against some really really tough fields, and now he's getting in with a softer field, and all of a sudden he's like, oh wow, I feel like a new horse here. And they run really good. So anyway, that's it for today. I want to thank you for tuning in. I appreciate it if you subscribe. It's free. And lots of luck. And I'll have another video, like I said. I'll talk a little bit about key drops in class in one of my upcoming videos. Thanks.